We decided together with the panelists to switch to English, if you don't mind. And I would like to call my panelists today to the podium. That is first Yulia Miadzvetskaya from the University of Tübingen. Welcome, Yulia. She's a doctoral researcher and our expert here on EU sanctions. Very important today. The second one is Lvovskiy from BEROC, an economic think tank. I hope that's right. If not, you can explain more. The third one is Sierz Naurodski, representative of the Association of Belarusian Business Abroad in the Baltic countries, and I guess still director of Case Belarus, right? You can explain later in detail. Here's the chair. And last but not least, Robert Kirchner, from the German economic team, deputy team leader, and with a broad and long-standing expertise on Belarus, on the economic perspective. So that's our podium. I guess we can send an applause to them. Thank you for your time to be here. And what we would like to do today is indeed to discuss a bit the situation right now regarding economic topics. And we decided in advance on the first hand to discuss the current economic situation in the country. Then we will discuss a bit the state of the EU sanctions and what is the status, what is to be expected. Thirdly, we will discuss the situation of the Belarusian business abroad. Then we will open the floor to the audience. Prepare for questions, please. And last but not least, we will try to have a look into the future, what is expected in the next, let's say, 12 months. The most interesting, but I guess the most difficult task here on the podium. So having said this, we will start without further ado. And we'll start with our first round here on the panel on the current economic situation. If you look into the figures in the last 12 months of the German-Belarusian trade relations, we saw a decline of about minus 25%. So in comparison to the first 10 months of last year. And that was already a Corona year with a lower trade volume. So Robert will start with a short introduction on the situation in Belarus in economic terms, and maybe with a view on external relations. And Lev will add. So we agreed on that. And Robert, maybe the first impulse from your side. You just have to speak to the mic. No further.
Does it? Yeah, it works. Yeah. Great. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. First of all, great honor to be here. It's not my first Minsk forum. Hope it won't be my last. So it's always great to be here on this economics panel. Now, looking at the economic situation, I would say it's quite clear that the situation is bad, and that is the current situation, and that is most probably also the medium to long-term outlook. So it is really a bad situation. And let me elaborate on that a bit more. If you look at GDP, which is like the most common indicator, we have the numbers for the first 10 months of this, so almost the year. It's 4.7% of decline in GDP, almost 5% of GDP decline, which is huge for Belarusian circumstances. That last time that happened, I think, was back in the 90s. And that is actually quite broad-based, right? Whether you look at the transport sector, whether you look at construction, trade, I mean, you see everywhere like double-digit decline in real terms. There are two kind of positive sectors. That's agriculture, which is kind of driving that little bit of growth, what is still there. But agriculture, you know, that can be due to a good harvest, so that's a very volatile thing. That's not necessarily something that lasts. And the IT sector, which used to be a kind of growth locomotive for many, many years, again, for the first 10 months of the year, it's 1-point-something% of GDP, so there's a huge deceleration in growth. Right now, it's more or less stagnant. It will probably decline. And here I think we see it's a flip side of this migration of IT experts that we see across Russia and Belarus. They are going to Georgia, Armenia, Turkey, and so on. And then they are like missing in countries like Belarus or Russia. And there you see the negative impact as well. So from that point of view, and then I talked about the medium and long term, we, together with our colleague Lev, we did a forecast some months ago. We had another small negative impact for next year forecasted. It may be stagnation next year, but still, I mean, the outlook is very bleak, right? And also, if we look beyond that, 24 and longer, the growth potential, I mean, I don't have any quantitative estimates on that, but I guess that will be something like 1% per year, probably in the best of the cases, that this country can be growing under current circumstances, and that's obviously for a country like Belarus, a transition economy, far too low, and that is actually, there's a gap to EU and to more developed markets becomes even bigger. Then inflation, double-digit, also a big problem. Real wages are declining. The authorities resorted to administrative measure, price freezes for some time. President was kind of taking charge and wanted to freeze prices. To some extent, it showed in the numbers, so inflation declined a bit, but it's obviously not a long-term solution, and it leads to the typical problems. Empty shelves also, we saw that as well, in some cases at least. Trade has been already set. It's still declining, and actually, if we would just look at the volume of the trade, just the goods, it would be even worse, because price effects to some extent have counterbalanced that trend. But still, overall trade is declining. And it is also taking a completely different direction now. So the trade with non-CIS countries is much further declining, including EU and so on, the sanction countries which have implemented sanctions. And exports to CIS, especially Russia, are to some extent growing. So there is a reorientation in trade as well. We have also some sectors where we don't have data anymore on the fiscal situation. Similar to Russia, Belarus has stopped publishing certain data, which makes it more difficult to follow the situation, which probably also complicates policy making, I would argue. But that's their problem. They are officially in default because they didn't pay or at least the money didn't reach the investors for Eurobonds. The only maybe silver lining is that a kind of financial collapse had been prevented. So the exchange rate is more or less stable now after it was also depreciating a lot. Reserves are on a stable level. So this kind of macro financial situation, I would argue it's still sort of okay. But everything else you look at, I would say the picture is not very good.
Thank you, Robert, for this first remarks. Lev, when we met last year for the Minsk Forum on the panel, I know that we wondering a bit why Belarus performed that well in 2021 in terms of economic figures. So this year is obviously much more bad. What is your explanation? I guess you have some for that. And what would you like to add to Robert's inputs?
Well, if we talk relative to 2021, then the story is simple. In 2021, Belarus lived through what economists call Belarusian small foreign trade miracle. Sanctions didn't work de facto in 2021. World prices were skyrocketing, at least for some goods like oil, potash, and wood, and Belarusian exports increased a lot, while Belarusian imports did not increase that much, and so it created this super positive trade balance, and it solved many problems that were accumulated in the economy from 2020. This year, sanctions started to work de facto, especially when the war started, and there were new sanctions, and old sanctions countries started to monitor them more closely. And therefore, no trade miracle, and basically, yes, sanctions are going into effect. So Robert mentioned several numbers about how things are going in Belarus. Indeed, it is technically the second worst recession since the 90s, given the speed of decline, although right now the speed of decline is diminishing. I decided to add on several qualitative trends in Belarus. So first qualitative trend is many of them come from government response, some of them come from peculiarity of sanctions. First response of the government is attempt to increase many small taxes and introduce many new small or mid-range taxes wherever is possible. So every month or maybe even every week, if you read Belarusian newspapers, there is a new tax on people who collect mushrooms, on people who collect data, on people who have dogs, depending on which type of a dog do you have, so on people who cross the border, so really a lot of new smaller taxes. Government, meanwhile, does not touch major taxes like VAT, but clearly this trend is a result that people inside of the government, they kind of try to avoid increasing the main taxes as long as possible, and they try to pacify, I guess, Lukashenko, who needs more money, with this large amount of small taxes. Another important qualitative fact is that Belarus is, de facto losing its status of IT country. In previous 10 years, Belarus already was in kind of stagnation. The average growth rate in Belarus was 1% GDP per year, and about half of this percentage point was given by IT sector. So IT sector was small, but always growing at a very fast rate, and it was attracting more and more people, giving like some hopes for future. Now IT is not a driver of growth anymore. For the last, since the war started, there were a couple of months when IT still was growing, but last several months it gives -8% year to year, -3% year to year, -6%. So such figures. Since the war began, IT industry lost 11,000 of employees. Given the relatively small size of this industry, so probably they used to have around 100,000, or at most 150,000, there are different numbers, so it's like 7-10% of the employment. And these people didn't become just unemployed, they moved to other countries, sometimes with their companies, with future investments and with future growth prospects. Another, what I would say, major, especially for business, the most important qualitative trend is instability, economic policy instability. During the usual economic crisis, that all of us lived through several of them, I guess, through our lives. Usual economic crisis is, things are bad, it's hard to get credit, people stop buying things, but you kind of have good ideas about the future. If you have money during economic crisis, usually it's like a great time for investment and enlarging of your operations. Now, if you would try to think how any Belarusian businessman or businesswoman thinks nowadays, it is a lot of instability, and instability not even monetary. So again, when you tell like some European economic instability, people probably think, high inflation. High inflation is there, but that's not the end of the story. Most of economic policies are subject to change, again, like once in a month, once in 2 months. You don't know what will be taxes next month. You don't know what would be the rules, official rules of your operations. It's not that you don't know what will be the inflation. It is you have no idea if banks actually will be able to transfer money or to give loans, or what will be the policy of central bank. So it's like a really huge economic policy instability. And I would end with 2 other trends. So another let's say positive for the Russian economy trend is whenever you have some sanctions, people adapt. And war is already with us for 9 months, 10 months, sorry. So sanctions were severe, but of course Belarus, as any other country, as any other number of economic agents, adapt to new conditions. We observed that, for example, oil sector of Belarus suffered a lot in April-May 2022. Real wages went down by 30-40% in these industries. But now they are only 5%, real wages only 5% below its a year ago level, which suggests that Belarusian refineries found ways to overcome sanctions, to ship their products somewhere else. Probably through Russia, but of course we don't know because everything is top secret. With potash, successes are not that big. The thing is not that they cannot find buyers for Belarusian potash. It is that they cannot find routes to transfer it somewhere. The only way where Belarusian potash goes now is to China through the railroads, and capacity is just 20, 30, at maximum 40% of the previous exports. So potash industry is still under huge stress, but I guess is trying to adapt. The last thing maybe surprising about people ask how Belarusian businessmen feel themselves. We recently had a survey and we found that actually people say that they feel themselves pretty good. This phenomenon comes from the fact that in the beginning of the war, people started to expect that it will be a total collapse. Indeed, Ukraine is the third trade partner of Belarus. European Union is the second trade partner of Belarus, so losing such huge amounts of trade could lead to a serious collapse. But overall, since the war began, there was no collapse. There was steady decrease in the economy. In some particular sub-industries, people really were losing jobs and losing like tens of percents of their earnings. But there was no total collapse. And in the recent surveys, businessmen say, well, okay, it's bad, but much better than we expected. So we are on a positive side.
Still a minus, but the minus is not that big. So you made some points, and let me refer to some of them. First, maybe to all of you on the panel, how do you assess or judge the answer on the crisis of the current administration? So, is it a good economic-driven approach? Is it just political? So, what is or give us an impression from your side how it is, how we should judge it? Is there still rationality? Are we close to panic? So where are we when it comes to the reaction of the situation? Everyone who feels to answer.
I can start. Well, first reaction was to make secret of most of the data. So now, for example, you don't know for sure what's going on in oil industry. For example, well, we still can see the real salaries, but we cannot see volumes of trade and where do they ship it. Actually, a lot of information now is covered. It's like we even don't know what's the budget situation. It's also a secret. We don't know what are the forex reserves consist of. So we know the total number, but we don't know which part of it is gold, SDRs, or liquid currency. So National Bank also stopped publishing their business attitudes, conjecture surveys. So we are missing a lot of information now, and this is like first step. Another step was that government tries to produce a positive picture if you would read Belarusian news, especially Prime Minister Golovchenko, he always tries to find some good-looking number, and then he gives 25 interviews with this good number. So his recent favorite was increase in foreign direct investments, which actually increased because the government forbade foreign businesses to transfer their earnings from Belarus. So now they only have an opportunity to reinvest it in Belarus. And so every interview starts and ends with that.
It's not a new inflow of FDI, it's just reinvestment.
Yeah. So they try to create this positive picture because there is actually kind of school of thought in Belarusian government that you can manipulate economic agents, the expectation that if everybody would believe that everything is positive, then economic agents will act as everything is positive, and they pursue this road. I don't think it's very successful, but they still try to do it a lot. Well, another trend is like sometimes we see some radical and half-thought policies. The recent example was this total price freeze by Lukashenko and head of Belarusian Statistical Agency. So they didn't prepare country, businessmen just said, okay, now you cannot increase taxes. Like about 20 businessmen went to prisons for increasing price of sausage or cheese. Then like 2 weeks after, like nothing happened, they said, okay, now we cancel this policy and change it to something at least a little bit more viable. So this is this example of economic policy instability.
Robert, you as German economic team, you did before in previous times a consultation to the government. Would that approach be one you would have advised to do so, or what would be your advice?
No, obviously not. And I mean, we have been very critical of administrative price regulations back since for many years, actually, because they always kind of played with that tool. And as you said, there are different camps, right, in the administration, more liberal ones, which basically were our main counterparts when we were still working with them. And then more like the hardliners, which kind of basically have a very socialist communist mindset. And in some of these measures, I have the impression that this is actually this group which is now dominating. But overall, as Lev said, if you don't have really data to analyze, then it's already something smells fishy, right? Because then you wonder why don't they want to show you the data? And then they show you other data, which are probably not so relevant, but they claimed it's a success. So overall, I'm not impressed by the economic policy response of the authorities. But overall, the collapse didn't happen, but actually, knowing Belarus, it was not expected to be that such an economy is collapsing. But overall, again, it's I would not say it's a good reaction. It's poor performance.
Do you want to? You don't have to. I just want to give the floor and the chance to reply and comment.
Yes, maybe I just would like to add, because your question was on what the Belarusian authorities, what they do with respect to sanctions, and I just would like to add that from a legal point of view, they try to contest those restrictive measures in front of the Court of Justice. So several Belarusian companies, including Belaruskali, Belas, MAS, then also Navigatsiya, Belavia as well, they all went in front of the Court of Justice to say that those sanctions do not comply with the principle of legality. And we know that in the past, several sanctions were actually struck down by the Court of Justice, exactly for the same considerations, that they did not rely on sufficient evidence. So it would be quite interesting to see in this case whether they will manage to strike them down through legal means.
That is a very interesting point, about sanctions. We have discussions here as well. Before I just want to make one other point before we get a bit more deeper into the sanction topic regarding the IT sector. Maybe one request. So you mentioned that it was really a growing sector that contributed to GDP growth, a kind of success model. We all know entrepreneurs, companies who've been there, who went there successfully, who left. What is your assessment? What does it mean for the economy for Belarus as a country when they are step by step losing this potential, let's say? Will it be really harsh for the economy to be able to set up innovations, to attract other companies, clusters? What is your assessment? Which role did this high-tech park and the IT industry play before, and what is Belarus losing right now because of these developments? Who else?
I can.
Les is always the icebreaker today.
For stealing, yeah. I would say, well, this decrease in IT, it's not causing any crisis right now. It is decreasing potential growth rate. So every country has its potential growth. If everything is great, if everything is going good. If in previous years Belarus was growing on average at 1%, well, then now without such huge growth from IT, this potential growth will be 0.7% or something like that.
Maybe to add also, it also brought a lot of foreign exchange earnings into the country. I think $1 billion or so per year, which is now also probably gone. It was not really deeply integrated into the domestic economy as we know it here, as it would be here, right? Because most of the demand would be domestically driven. Actually, I would say 80-90% came from abroad, right? The clients were abroad. So in a sense, it was an offshore sector, right? Similar also to other IT sectors in the region. Ukraine is the same thing. So it's not that the people leaving there, that the domestic economy gets completely disrupted because, in every company the IT guy is leaving. So it was in a way separate sector. But the loss is basically it's the most talented people which are leaving the country, and that is a huge, as Gleb said, brain drain. Huge decline in potential GDP, so negative.
So thank you very much. We just talked about sanctions already a bit. Yulia is with us, as I introduced her, as our expert on sanctions right now here on the panel. So you are working on this topic. You published a policy paper, and maybe you can give us an idea of your findings of the paper on the current sanction that the EU issued against Belarus. Your assessment, and then we will open here on the panel again the floor for your assessment and comments. But first, Yulia, please, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and I would like to thank you, the organizers of the Minsk Forum, for the kind invitation and for this opportunity to present my research, which was written with the support of the German Marshall Fund of the United States. In my presentation here, I will provide a broader perspective on the EU sanctions. So first of all, what I notice in the EU sanctions policy is that EU sanctions go through a mini revolution due to a triple phenomenon. First of all, we see that there is a broadening of listing criteria. Listing criteria, these are reasons why someone is being put on the EU sanctions list. So while in the beginning those sanctions were enacted against those who participated in the election falsification and in the post-electoral violence, then those listing criteria through time, they were updated also to include those who were involved in the state-sponsored instrumentalization of migrants, and later on they targeted also those who were involved in the support for the Russian aggression against Ukraine. What does this mean from a practical perspective? It means that the broader the listing criteria, the easier it would be to support them with the reasons for listing and also with evidence. The second phenomenon that I would like to highlight in my presentation is the sectoralization of EU restrictive measures. What I mean by this? I mean that the EU is now shifting from targeted sanctions to broader economic measures. And this is a real revolution in the EU sanctions policy since the mid-90s. The EU, following the UN example, decided to proceed only with targeted sanctions, since broader economic measures inevitably have negative consequences for the population of the country, and there were multiple reports with respect to Iraq and to negative humanitarian consequences of broader economic measures. What we witness at the moment, what the EU does, this is exactly the opposite, because if in the beginning the EU was reluctant to target several sectors of the Belarusian economy, now we see that those measures that were enacted, they target sensitive sectors of the Belarusian economy, including potash and oil products. However, we also notice that the EU, in the way how it designs its sanctions, it tries to apply several derogations. Those derogations, they are of humanitarian nature, like, for instance, the landing, takeoff, and the overflight of the European airspace might be allowed for Belarusian airlines in case if there is an emergency situation. Also, the provision of several health-related products, pharmaceutical products, might be also allowed for humanitarian considerations. Then there are also several derogations based on economic interest, like, for instance, contracts that were concluded prior to the enactment of sanctions. They still, some of them, they will be still operational and remain in force even after the adoption of restrictive measures. And then we also have security-related considerations, because we know that the EU enacted several restrictive measures that apply to dual-use goods. However, the export of these dual-use goods might be still allowed in case if there are some safety-related considerations or environmental considerations relating, for instance, to nuclear safety. And also, when we speak about those broader economic measures, of course, we all understand they do have negative consequences for the Belarusian population as well. And just as I mentioned previously, that the Belarusian authorities, they try to contest those measures, not only at the high political level, but also in the courtrooms. And for instance, Belaruskali challenged its listing on the EU sanctions list, and it was claiming that those sanctions, that they are not targeted anymore, and they have broader consequences for the civilian population, not only in Belarus, but also in the rest of the world. And I think this is the first time that the Court of Justice of the European Union will deal with the fact that a specific company contests the targeted nature of EU restrictive measures on the basis of the principle of legality, and it will be extremely interesting to see what will be the outcome of this case. The third phenomenon that I would like to outline is the fact that we see novel measures in the EU sanctions toolbox. For instance, there are prohibitions to have deposits extending 100,000 euros for all Belarusian citizens and residents, except for those who are based in the European Union and who have residence permit in the European Union, in Switzerland, or in one of the countries of the European Economic Area. And we also know that the way discussions, this has not come into force, but the way discussions with respect to visa bans, first of all, national visa bans, EU-wide visa bans, I think this is not something which is going to happen. But those measures, these are nationality-based measures, which means that they apply to all country nationals, and they rely on the principle of loyalty. What this means, the principle of loyalty, it's a connection that any citizen has with respect to his or her state. And this principle of loyalty is understandable. For instance, when we speak about Germany, of course, any German citizen derives certain rights from the fact of being citizen of this country, but also has certain duties and obligations with respect to the German state. But this principle of nationality can be contested and is very controversial with respect to autocratic regimes with even totalitarian tendencies as the one that we have in Belarus. Also, we see some novel measures in the EU sanctions toolbox, such as broadcast bans. We don't have those broadcast bans with respect to Belarusian TV channels, but we have with respect to Russian TV channels. But I do believe that those broadcast bans are just a matter of time with respect to Belarusian TV channels, because in most of the cases, the narratives of the Belarusian TV channels mirror what the Russian TV channels say about war, and it's war propaganda, so they must be also banned. And on the basis of what I presented, I would like to also highlight two main dilemmas that I think the European Union has now with respect to Belarus. So the first dilemma, it's about delimitation between the Belarusian authorities and the Belarusian citizens, because we all speak that we shall not mix it. We shall adopt restrictive measures that do not have far-reaching consequences and impact on the Belarusian population. However, this is easier said than done. And of course, what the European Union could do is to pursue its policy of two-track approach, so its support for the Belarusian civil society, for the Belarusian democratic forces, by including them in the Eastern Partnership framework, also in the newly launched European policy community. And on the other hand, targeting the Belarusian authorities and trying to adopt calibrated measures that will target the Belarusian authorities. The second dilemma that we have with respect to Belarus is the fact that it's very difficult to decouple Belarus from Russia. We see that many sanctions that the EU enacted with respect to Belarus, they also mirror EU sanctions against Russia. And this is completely understandable, taking into account the erosion of the Belarusian sovereignty, given the recently signed agreement on the tax harmonization between Belarus and Russia, the presence of the Russian troops in Belarus. And this is also understandable, taking into account that the European Union put the fight against the sanctions circumvention on the forefront of its foreign policy. And of course, Russia could use Belarus for bypassing several export restrictions and also some financial sanctions. And I would claim that while aligning EU sanctions on Belarus with EU sanctions on Russia is totally understandable, the EU still needs calibrated and country-specific approach with respect to Belarus, because it might be dangerous to treat Belarus just as a part of the EU foreign policy agenda on Russia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yulia. It's very sound analysis of what the EU is doing. My question to the whole podium would be, how do you assess how companies, how the administration cope with these sanctions? How do they deal? What about the capability of the system to adapt to the sanctions, to find new ways for export, for financing projects, and so on and so forth? What is your assessment, your impression? How do they deal? The question is, do sanctions really hurt or not in the end? So what is your assessment, if you have one? I don't know who would take the question.
I can say a few words and maybe start. So some observations, because again, coming back to what Lev said, an increasing amount of data is not being published, and especially these trade-related data where you could actually see whether sanctions work or not. So I would argue if it would be no impact at all, they would love to show us these data, right? But they don't. And then the other thing is, finding new markets is one thing, and we talked about potash, oil products, and so on. But you also need to find the new trade logistics to these markets, because usually these markets are far away from those that you delivered before the EU, right? So it's new clients plus new logistics. And to some extent, you're also competing with Russia on the same railway lines where Russia is now also trying to export their goods, which are not wanted here anymore. So overall, I think it is very difficult for the authorities. I think at some point we will have some sort of stabilization, bottoming out. I think we see that in the macro pictures at least now. So economies can and will adapt. We need to close loopholes. That's, I think, something that automatically comes with sanctions, that once you introduce them, you need to start closing loopholes, because apparently clever people will try to circumvent them. So that's a never-ending story, actually, to adapt to this. But I'm actually quite skeptical that the system is really kind of coping with the challenge, because we have now, and they have announced a huge import substitution program with Russia. Russia is going to give them 1.5 or 7 billion euros for import substitution, because they see already that products are missing, right? That's why they want to substitute them. But if I look back how the state has tried to modernize various industries, the woodworking industry, the cement industry, and so on, this was always ended in a disaster, right? The state-driven modernization was always kind of creating more problems than it solved. At the end of the day, you had a state-owned company with huge losses and debt, and not really productive. And I could imagine that this import substitution policy will go into the same direction, my skeptical view. So overall, I think significant challenges for the authorities.
Well, does it work? Yes. So answering this question, do sanctions hurt? Yes, they do hurt, for sure. Now, they have several effects. One is that the government, of course, cannot overcome the sanctions fully and cannot do it on their own. So sanctions hurt the economy. They also will make Belarus more dependent on Russia. Russia is now the only country which gives loans to Lukashenko's government. Yes, as Robert said, recently they gave $1.74 billion. If Russia will not give money, then the crisis will be much, much worse. Russia is also the main hope for logistics to reach far markets. But it's not that Russia just runs of their way to help Belarus. Russia, of course, has its own interests. For example, the hardest logistic problem is with transferring potash. And if you would watch these relationships, like every month, some Belarusian authority signs with some Russian politician agreement that they will start building a seaport for Belarusian potash in Russia. And then month goes by, and then they sign a new agreement. So it's like Santa Barbara. Eventually, potash still goes just by railways to China, and there are no other roads.
Someone else with comments?
Maybe just a comment, because when we are speaking about the impact of sanctions, I have an impression that we speak about the economic operators in Belarus, but I think it's also interesting to see what's going on the EU side. I don't know, I don't have data, economic data, but I know that at the moment in the European Union there are several efforts and several initiatives undertaken in order to fight against the circumvention of sanctions, which might have a lot of impact on the European business from the point of view of over-compliance. Since taking into account that the circumvention of sanctions has been recognized as a crime, I would claim that the economic operators from the European Union, and even potentially from abroad, will be very careful, and this might limit the margin for maneuver of Belarusian businesses.
If I may leave shortly my role as a moderator and go to the role of the German Eastern Business Association, I just can confirm this tendency. So even if you have companies who like to sell something which is not under sanction and everything is clear, and here BAFA in Germany handed out all documents, it's very, very hard and takes lots of time to find a bank who will finance this export business. So it's not about big things, but even smaller ones, and all cleared. You hardly find a bank, and takes time and lots of money. And I know one case where in the end a bank from Belarus took the risk, and not a Western bank. So what you mentioned, that is really tackles the nerves of the international system. But Robert,
sorry, if I may just two observations. One is already mentioned overcompliance. So actually, sanctions can have additional effects which are not like according to the law, but people in their behavior, they kind of anticipate that might be, or there might be future sanctions, increase in the sanctions and so on, so they stay away from that. That's one additional impact, which kind of strengthens it. The other thing is, I mean, we have like trade and we have financial flows, and usually they are connected, right? You're trading, you're selling a good, but you get money for that, right? And if you just sanction one part of the story, the financial sanctions, certain banks, then you might run into problems simply on the financing side, so you cannot really trade the good that actually is without any sanctions, but since you cannot find financing, you do not trade. So it's also a kind of strengthening of the impact.
Yeah, I just wanted to agree on the point that you just mentioned, that we discuss only sanctions that like some countries or groups of countries decide, but there is also a huge effect of non-sanctions but toxicity. For example, with IT sector, there were no sanctions on Belarusian IT sector. Well, for one company, yes, but for the rest, no. The reason why IT is leaving Belarus is that they are very much subject to these toxicity effects. Their clients don't want to make orders because, some clients don't want to make orders because IT people sit in Belarus. Some people don't want to invest in a startup which is headquartered in Belarus. So it's not even sanctions, it is these toxicity effects. Russia, of course, has much stronger toxicity effects. We've seen that many businesses just roll out of Russia. It's weaker for Belarus, but still there is sizable effects of that.
Thanks a lot. So I will just close this round on sanctions and move to our third part as announced and go on with Sierz on the Belarusian business abroad. Sierz, we met last time in September in Warsaw, where I had the honor to participate in a meeting of Belarusian business women and men abroad. And maybe you can give us an insight what is ABBA doing right now, maybe an understanding how many people from the business sector are out of the country. So we heard that about 10,000 people from the IT sector roughly left. Maybe you can paint a bit the picture of the landscape. Where are the people? What are they doing? Do we see IT companies outside of Belarus? So what is the situation?
Yeah, thank you, Stefan. Good afternoon. Answering your very first question, I am a case senior economist now, not case Belarus director anymore. I will give you a few numbers so that nobody sleeps after the lunch about how many people do I think and do we think, according to our research, left Belarus, and how many companies basically left Belarus. These numbers are not super huge, as I expected, to be honest. In regards to people, according to our estimations, this is around 135,000 of people have left Belarus since August 2020. 135,000. I'm telling this number is one of them, the one that we are absolutely sure. It could be higher. And I remember we have a chat in the expert community in Belarus, and we had this vote on this expert vote on how many people do you think have left. And this number is according to this average rate, more or less, which is also a very good estimation. So I think that, but we are talking about EU. I'm sorry, not to be very specific. We're talking about EU, 135,000 to the EU only. We're not talking about Georgia or, let's say, Central Asia, no. So this is the EU numbers. About companies, well, we have seen in the registrations after August 2020, around 2,100 companies were registered with Belarusian capital. 2,100. Again, this is not a huge number, but as you can understand, it's normally in life you cannot simply just have a company in Belarus and then suddenly have a company in other country. This doesn't happen in this way. You either have companies in both and you come and open up a business if you have an ability to do so. In other case, you would come and you can make a startup of your own as a, for instance, self-employed person. And this is normally the case for those who have left the country very urgently, right? It's not that you plan to leave or you used to have a company there. No. Again, when you live in the country and you live in just one bag and you come to Poland, for instance, Lithuania, you would expect to start with a very small activity. Small company or being self-employed. So, how many self-employed? Again, it was a bit tricky number to estimate, and we have used average numbers for European Union in terms of startups and self-employment of migrants, and we come up to a number again of around 2,000 of people that have already opened self-employment or would potentially open it soon. Again, this is self-employed and startups and different stages of development. So altogether, the potential of Belarusian companies in European Union right now, this is around 4,000, 4,100 since August 2020. Is it a lot? No, this is, to be honest, not a lot. I would expect more, but these are. But you have to look at the structure of these companies. Of course, as I said, they're not the huge companies, and not huge IT companies, or let's say, we don't know how much impact they will have, just because we need some time, we need some more numbers, some figures, and I'm sure that in 2023 we will come up with the estimation of how much these companies will create. How much they will influence on GDP, on European GDP, and on investments, and also on working places. That's for sure. In terms of numbers for Belarus, well, these 4,000 companies, this is around 1% of all companies that exist in Belarus. 1% of all companies, including self-employment, including these individual entrepreneurships. In Belarus. So again, this number is not huge, and does this really hurt Belarusian budget? No. So far to the data, back to the data when we had access to it, it's for over July 2022. Amount of taxes that were paid by all companies in Belarus were higher than for the same period of 2021. So basically there was the amount of taxes paid was growing. And in 2021, number of taxes paid by all companies were even higher than in 2020. Again, even after the crisis of 2020, we still had companies paying taxes more. But again, this is all the companies together, private companies and state-owned companies. So this is the broad picture.
You can, of course, proceed, but I would have a question regarding the problems or the challenges companies are facing right now. You described the situation some people or a lot of people had just with only one bag arriving in another country. So what are the problems and the challenges companies are facing? So in the first panel, looking to the Foreign Office colleagues, we had some discussions on national persons regarding visa and passports and so on. What are the challenges or bottlenecks companies are facing in Poland, Lithuania? I don't know if some companies are in Germany already, but I guess the majority, I guess, is in the Baltic states and in Poland, right?
Well, these challenges are very trivial. The first thing is to move your capital away from Belarus. It's not feasible almost at all. I mean, you cannot transfer it via bank just because this is too toxic for Western banks, for EU banks. This is really difficult when you transfer cash, right? Because, again, in today's world, you cannot simply transfer the cash. It has to be for something, right? It has to, specifically for companies. It can be your capital, your own capital for a company, but again, the bank will be very curious about where does this capital come from, and checking the clearness of your capital will take you a long time. So this is the first question, the first issue. The second issue is transfer of people, of your employees. This is a little bit in line with what we have discussed in the first panel, right? The problem of visa. Yeah, there are programs, specific programs for relocation, which is super good. Super good. And to my personal perception, in my opinion, the programs like Poland Business Harbor, they work perfectly. Just because they allow people with different qualifications to apply. Which means you're not only looking for a Schengen visa to come and stay and find any job you want. No, if you're an engineer or you're a doctor, you basically have to have a right. Well, I'm saying it, sorry to say it, a right. No, it's not a right. But say you have to have an opportunity to find the job you are good at, right? This is very important. So the programs for middle qualified and highly qualified employees, there is still a huge lack of such programs. Again, Poland Business Harbor is a good example, but in my personal opinion, these programs should exist in most of the EU countries. Because this is a win-win solution. The company can relocate and bring and create new working places. The employees can find and can have a job and pay taxes in the country where they relocate. And the country, the hosting country, will be able to close their employment gaps, which are also huge here in the European Union. We all know it. Specifically for high-skilled and middle-skilled labor force. This is not a secret, I guess, for all of you. And if you specifically, it's not only a problem of the Western countries like Germany. If you look at Slovakia or Czech Republic or Poland, there's a huge demand for high-skilled professionals. These are these are the two key challenges, and there's a third one, also very important one. It's the transfer of equipment. Yeah, this is a rare occasion and a rare problem, just because it touches only the production companies, not services, but production companies. And as far as I told you, the structure of Belarusian business here is that most of them are small and medium companies. And most of these small and medium companies are services companies. So again, this equipment is not a huge problem for them. But I know a few examples when, let's say, a production company with quite a huge potential, they couldn't just bring equipment from their country to another one. It's simply very, very difficult to do physically. So these are the key challenges. But again, they are not very specific, and I'm sure we can have solutions for them, and they can be more market-based. It's not that we need the European Commission to jump in and make some regulations. No, I think it's just enough of just open up your country markets for professionals, or let's say for more visa programs, and I'm sure this will be a win-win solution.
Thank you, Serge. One question before I open the floor for the audience about the dynamic of it. You mentioned the number of people who left Belarus. So what is your impression of the numbers? Where are we right now? Are people leaving the country right now? In which numbers, in which figures? Do you see that companies are leaving? So what is the dynamics so that we get a feeling? Is the wave over or is it still ongoing? If someone else wants to reply, of course, feel free. That may be the first question to you.
Stefan, it's very difficult to say. This is about our feelings. This is a speculation. Yeah, we had a very strong waves after the August 2020 and after February 22. Year 22, of course. So yeah, these were high waves. But as far as I see, for instance, at the data in Poland, a number of companies, a number of permits issued, the wave is still strong. And Poland is around 80% of all companies who transferred from Belarus to the EU. Poland is 80%. So, yeah, new companies in Poland are still opening very fast. And over 9 months of 2022, it was the number of new companies with Belarusian capital, not self-employed, only companies, were already close to the total 21 year 2021, which means the total number will be huge, bigger ever in history, and Belarus is now getting up number 2 country for Poland in terms of let's say matter of doing business. Let's say country that matters, or let's say capital that matters. In Poland is Belarus number 2, Ukraine is number 1 now.
If I may add about troubles of Belarusian business abroad, yeah, I agree with everything that Sierz said. It's mainly usual problems of business relocation, but I would add another one. So toxicity that we discussed on the previous question, unfortunately, this does not only applies to Belarusian state companies. It also, of course, applies to Belarusian private companies in Belarus, and even probably more unfortunate to relocated companies from Belarus. So when we've heard today in the beginning that European governments, ambassadors, they look differently at Belarusian society and Belarusian government, but banks in Georgia, banks in Lithuania, they do not separate Belarusian society and Belarusian government. So whenever these people come to at least certain European Union countries, they have also additional layer of problems stemming from this toxicity.
Yeah, and quickly add to this. This is true, of course, and this is our role. You ask what we in Associated Belarusian Business Abroad can do. This is our business to help this, to make this problem not to be a systemic problem, but the problem of very specific banks. So we come up to a bank and we talk to them and we ask them, what do you really need to make sure that this is not the case that you want to continue for longer, or let's say what can we do this so that this continue in the future. So yeah, this is again the problem, but I'm sure that together and we can easily solve this. And we have to talk. We have to be open. We have to tell them, look, we are Belarusians. We are not only asking you for money. No, we are here to make new employment, to make a new investment, and to help European economy grow in the future.
Robert, you would make it right?
Actually, I have a question, if I may. In this relocation that you investigated, is it an either-or decision? So I'm closing my business there and I'm going abroad, or do you see also that companies, domestic companies, are starting, to open abroad branches, whatever, to be more diversified, to have not all the eggs in the basket of Belarus, which apparently is not going well, and also in the future. So they are trying to, internationalize. That would be also, in my view, a rational strategy of many business abroad, in Belarus, to kind of start having stronger operations abroad. Of course, if it's political, if you're exiled, it's not possible.
Yeah.
But
Thank you, Robert. This is a very interesting question. We try to answer that now, though I think we need much more deeper research on that. However, I have an answer now. I think that 47% of the companies who relocate still have their operation office in Belarus. Okay. Again, I was a little bit surprised of this number because I thought that would be higher. Let's say up to 2/3 of the company. But only half of them still own it, which means that the key strategy is still to keep both ties. And when you talk to the companies, you would rare find a company who would say, "Yeah, we skip the business. No, I don't want." It would be rather self-employment or if micro businesses, something like this. Yeah, that those who exist in Belarus. But when you are talking about medium or even big companies, then it's rarely that they close it, but they try to keep at least some part of the business, maybe some restructured business, or let's say sell or transform into other companies, but still interrelated. And this is again very important, just because we want at ABBA, and I personally am fond of it, that when the political crisis is over, we want those companies to participate in new Belarus, which means that the capital that they bring here now needs to be transferred somehow back. Of course, we cannot expect it will be 100%. No, never. But let's say the experience, new capital gain, and of course all of this, managerial EU regulations, sustainability issues should be transformed to Belarus when everything is over. It's a crucial thing, I think.
So thank you very much for the 3 rounds here on the panel on the current economic situation, on the sanctions, and on the situation of the companies abroad. I guess we got a lot of food for thought, and now I would like to open the floor to the audience and just motivate you to go to the microphone and post a question. So please, you have to go over there, since we have to record you. Maybe introduce you shortly.
Okay, my name is Alexander Toshnikov from Reform By, journalist. Thank you for a very interesting panel. So, economic panels are usually dull, but that's not the case. And thank you for speaking about negative effects of sanctions. And I'd like to ask you about positive effects. I can see at least 2 of them. One is that companies under sanctions are less attractive to privatization, and with our situation where there is no public control, they can be sold to Russian businessmen, etc. And the second positive effect, as I see it, that they're targeting corruption. Because let's be naive, income from selling goods to the West is not going 100% to budget. It sometimes goes to private companies, to pockets of people close to Lukashenko family. So what do you think of it? Are these factors really on the table, or I just invented them? Thank you.
Who would like to take it?
Well, I guess because sanctions now are so big, they touch many spheres of Belarusian economy and society, and there are many effects, including these that you've mentioned. So selling Belarusian enterprises to Russia, I think, is a big potential problem. Well, not maybe for now, but for future of Belarus. Again, we always were dependent, very linked to Russian economy. Now this link is even higher. If we used to have 50% trade, 50% of Belarusian trade was with Russia. Now it's 70%. And if Russia always used to give us most of money, but we also could get some loans from other countries, now it's only from Russia. And yes, there are, of course, movements from some Russian business to maybe try to acquire some Belarusian businesses. And sanctions may be one of the mechanisms that make Belarusian business less attractive. In this case, I also think that Lukashenko himself doesn't really want to sell too much to Russians, because he wants to have power to himself, not to Belarusian people, but also not to Russians. We've seen a couple of examples, recent examples, where some European businesses, for example, they wanted to sell their share in Belarus, and it looked like kind of Lukashenko personally or somebody around Lukashenko forbidden these sales so that Russian businesses would not buy them. So it's on the level of rumors, but I believe this was, for example, a case with Sineva, which was operated by Swedish, but some Russian businesses wanted to buy it. And with regard to corruption, well, I don't know what can fight corruption in Belarus. Here I doubt that sanctions help, because, the main enemy of corruption is information, and is when you see what is going on. Now, as I said, one of the first responses to sanctions from the Belarusian government was to close data. When you close data, you have no idea who steals what. So maybe, I don't know, half of oil exports now are stolen by some individual. We would never find it out because we don't know anything about it.
I see Robert and Sierz would like to comment.
Yeah, just briefly. I actually expect corruption to increase. I think tensions in general will increase. I mean, when you have a growing economy, everyone can be happy with its own share because it's growing. But if the pie, the pizza, is not growing anymore but shrinking, then what one gains, he gains it only at the expense of other people. So this will create tensions, right, between the system, between the nomenclatura, with Russians and so on. So I would not be surprised that this further increases the pressure.
Thank you. Do we have further questions from the audience? Yeah, please. You can go over there to the mic and take it.
Yeah, Robert Sperfeld of the Heinrich Böll Foundation. I have two questions. First is the request to elaborate a little bit. On the one hand, you said, there's a need to calibrate the sanctions against Belarus in comparison to Russia, to distinguish between the countries. And on the other hand, it was said that, it's so much intertwined and linked to each other. So how can that look in practice? And the second question is with regard to the energy sector. Like all over Europe, we are talking about energy crisis and energy price crisis. Obviously, it does not affect Belarus in the same way. Is that maybe even to the contrary an issue where the Belarusian economy benefits from right now, because actually it has a surplus of electricity generation and so on and so forth. So what's the situation in the energy sector? Yeah, basically.
Thank you. So maybe, Yulia, I guess the question on better sanctions goes to you, I guess.
Thank you very much for your question, and it's not an easy one. Indeed, my suggestion for EU policymakers would be to differentiate Belarus from Russia. But the way how to do it, I would say, I refer mostly to the strategic communication on behalf of the European Union, because sometimes we have an impression that Belarusians are being treated in the same way as Russians. Like, for instance, when we had those discussions on the potential EU-wide visa ban, this provoked a lot of doubts and questioning in the Belarusian society whether the same would apply to Belarusians, especially taking into account that every day there are rumors that the Belarusian army might also participate in the Russian war against Ukraine. So I would mostly refer to the fact that while sanctioning the Belarusian authorities, the European Union needs to, in its strategic communication, needs to make clear that it differentiates Belarus from Russia, that they're not being all the time put in the same basket. And I think this relates also to this other argument about differentiating the Belarusian authorities from the Belarusian society, because sometimes when we just refer to Belarus involvement in the Russian war against Ukraine, we have an impression that we are speaking about not only the Belarus as a country, but also about the Belarusian society, including civil society as well.
Thank you. On the energy topic, who wants to?
Oh, I can try to start. With energy, Belarus is suffering from energy crisis, but it's a very different type of energy crisis. So right now, Belarus is getting cheap energy, cheap gas, cheap oil. So everything is fantastic. People heat their homes, they're inefficient homes, and everybody are happy, pay very low prices for their houses. But there are some problems that are coming ahead, and they're coming because of this war. And unfortunately, I'm afraid they're coming like under any circumstances. The thing with Belarus oil refineries is that the previous scheme, they were of course always important for Belarusian experts. The previous scheme was as following. Ukraine, of course, stopped buying Russian oil, especially after the war of 2014, but they were buying Russian oil from Belarus at a premium margin. So Belarus was buying cheap Russian oil, transforming it to oil products, and then selling to Ukraine. And it was really a premium market for Belarus because Ukraine didn't have other easy logistical ways to supply themselves with oil products. They started now to change it only after this war started. This situation will probably not be revived even after this war will end. So right now, of course, Ukraine is buying like minimal amounts of Belarusian oil products, like 10 times less or 15 times less. When the war will be over, either Belarus will also be in a status of co-aggressor, and so Ukraine will continue to buy oil products from somebody else, maybe Azerbaijan, maybe European Union. Or, for example, if things will change in both Russia and Belarus, then they would not need Belarus as a missing link between Russian market and Ukrainian market. So it is likely that we've lost at least this highly marginal market for all the near future.
Robert, please.
Yeah, maybe just to add on that, I mean, there are always two sides, industry and population, households, right? Like in the discussion here in Germany. And in the short term, in the household side, I would say you can keep households happy because you don't have to subsidize energy because it's very cheap. So it is on that sense good for the budget that there are no big amounts of money are required. Obviously, the downside is that people don't have any incentives for energy efficiency and so on. So it keeps this inefficient structure on the household side. On the industry side, basically, to add on what Lev said, if you have cheap energy for your industry, okay, but a lot of the products that you're producing are either under sanctions also, or you can only send it to the Russian market where they have the same kind of cheap energy. So I don't see a big benefit on that side as well. So overall, due to the sanctions and the situation, Belarus cannot really benefit a lot from this cheap energy.
Thanks, Robert. We have 7 minutes left and 2 questions. So maybe we collect the 2. So please go to the mic and then we take the 2 questions to the podium.
Thank you so much for the discussion and for the input. Very exciting, very interesting. We've been talking about the current situation of the economy in Belarus, and I'd be interested in the potential in the future situation with regards to economics. If we imagine that the war in Ukraine is over, and we do hope that eventually this will happen, if we imagine that Belarus has had free democratic elections and we have a basis for economic reforms, how would you estimate the potential of the Belarusian economy? What would be the conditions necessary to better integrate Belarusian economy in the European market? I do remember the discussions we had in 2020 at the Belarusian Congress, for instance, where economic experts were discussing exactly this question, the potential, and have been quite optimistic about the future of Belarusian economy, saying that despite the dependency on the Belarusian economy, the resources, the potential is quite high because of all the people, because of the IT sector, etc. So it was quite optimistic, and they were saying that the crisis and the shock of the 90s is unlikely in Belarus. Did this change now, 2 years into the crisis, into the war? How would you estimate this situation now? Thank you so much.
Thank you. We take the last question.
Yeah, thank you. I have a question on the panelists concerning the sanctions. I mean, I understand the moral case. You want to punish the regime and introduce sanctions. But the objective of sanctions seems to be either the regime suffers so much that it changes its policy, or the population suffers so much that it gets rid of the regime. Now, in the moment we punish Lukashenko, but the regime doesn't change its policy, and the population doesn't change the regime. So something seems to be wrong with the sanctions. And so if you would be in the position of the EU, what would you change with the sanction regime to make it more effective?
Thank you very much for the two questions. So the last one, I guess, would have enough for an hour for further discussion. I would, by the way, add a third goal of sanctions, but maybe some of you will talk about it. So maybe first maybe discuss first the sanctions question, and then the potential of the Belarusian economy. I guess it's a good topic to look into the future and to finalize the discussion. And so maybe a reaction or reflection on the sanction question. So we do not see a regime change. We do not see a big wave from the people to changes. So what is your assessment or the answer?
I would say that quite often when we are discussing sanctions, we have an impression that sanctions are a miracle, like an instrument which is capable of solving the current situation. But I think we shall depart from this way of thinking, because sanctions are just one of the instruments in the EU foreign policy toolbox. And of course, I would advocate that this instrument shall be used wisely in a way that the European Union shall try in the future to extract as many concessions from the Belarusian authorities as possible. For this, I would also say that sanctions, they shall be used together along with some other instruments, like most probably some non-formal diplomatic engagements, even though I think this might be contrary to the idea and to the policy which is being advocated by the Belarusian democratic forces. But in my opinion, the European Union shall do as much as possible also to free those people who are behind the bars at the moment. So in my opinion, we shall not forget that sanctions, it's a foreign policy tool, but it's not the only one, and it shall be used in combination with some other tools as well.
Thank you. Maybe, Sierz, you can take the sanctions topic and then add maybe the outlook and starting the final round on the podium.
Well, there are two things I would change. The first thing is to bring more positive agenda together with sanctions. I mean, you have to give both. So to mitigate the negative effects of sanctions for normal people, you have to have the other instruments of positive agenda. So the positive agenda should be so that people, the normal people who are affected by the sanctions, can do something with their future. In very specific cases, these are, first of all, visas, right? So the more visas would be perfect mitigation mechanism against of sanctions. Second thing would be, as I said, also for instance, the ability to open up companies here in Western Europe. This would also help. Provided very good verification, and banks normally do this, and we also, for instance, in ABBA can do this. We can help with verification of the business. But provided you can transfer capital and you can open up a new business in the European Union, again, for a normal company who doesn't want to be affected by sanctions, this would work. Again, this is a mitigation, so this is the first thing. The second thing, I would even further develop EU mechanism or any other mechanism to be more segmented. This means, in case of Belarus, this is a very specific case because Belarus is a very specific economy in terms of state-owned economy and private-owned economy. These are perfectly two different economies that coexist in one economy, state-owned and the private sector. So this is why actually we have to have this mitigation mechanism, because many private businesses have to get the positive effect. But let's say if we could segment the sanctions, for instance, for state-owned companies only, somehow, I don't know how technically to do it, but let's say it does exist, then this would be it would have even more positive effect than it has now. This is my personal opinion. In terms of further reforms, this is a super difficult question, and you basically mentioned two things: the reforms in Belarus, which I don't want to touch. I hope Lev and Robert will do it, and the other thing is to be included into European Union, into European Union area, let's say economic area, right? Well, here the mechanism hasn't changed since years. You have to sign up an agreement with the area, with the European Union, European Economic Area. This agreement will be only possible when we lift the sanctions, and lifting sanctions is a huge issue that we will face in the first year of, let's say, democratic changes, because these mechanisms are often very complicated, and you have to comply with this mechanism, which is not always easy, and you have to prove sometimes that you are not anymore as a sanctions subject. So again, this is the crucial thing, is to lift up the sanction, and second is to discuss the agreement as soon as we can, right away. The next day, I would say that we have to discuss the new agreement with the European Union, and maybe lifting sanctions should be part of this discussion. When Ukraine discussed the FTA Plus agreement in early 2010s, there was very difficult discussions, negotiations, extremely difficult, technically difficult, but they found out the solutions. So I'm sure that having the Ukrainian experience and having Moldovan experience and having Armenian experience, by the way, we can discuss them now. Sorry to be long.
So I just see my staff sergeant coming over and asking for stop it. So we have three last statements here. Sanctions and future.
Yeah, well, I will concentrate on the potential. So sanctions, I will leave to my successors here. Maybe two things, because it's a huge, broad strategic topic. I would probably more pessimistic now rather than 2 years back, because now the kind of embrace from the Russian economy is so strong that you really that's a real challenge to kind of get rid of these, brotherly embrace. Ukraine, I mean, they did it, but from a lower starting point, right? So I would say first is to try to trade on market terms with Russia as much as this is possible, because I think a lot of these problems create that you get cheap that you get cheap energy and so on. So then there was always some sort of quid pro quo. So once you are building everything on pure market terms, I think that's already a big step forward. It costs money, but maybe the EU can help there. I think that's also what the Baltics did in their independence, after their independence. And the second is, trade, WTO membership, which was discussed for, 30 years or so. And then a DCFTA with the EU, which was also the way forward for Ukraine. And by now, Ukraine is trading more than 60% with the EU now. So really, the EU market is now the prime destination. So it helps to diversify from the situation right now, which I think is unhealthy economically because it's simply concentrated on Russia. And this is something where the country needs to move forward with a lot of support.
Maybe just to say briefly on the DCFTA question, I think the situation of Belarus would be more difficult than the situation of Ukraine because Belarus is part of the Eurasian Economic Union. And from a legal perspective, the conclusion of such an agreement is not possible. So it will be not that far-reaching as the case of Ukraine.
Quickly, Stephanie, it's not possible. It hasn't been done before, but again, we have a case of Armenia, which is... Yeah, they don't have DCFTA, of course, But still, they don't say, if you ask a European Commission, they say that it's not possible, it's difficult. Yeah, it's difficult, but it's still possible.
So difficult means it's possible.
Well, a couple words about future. Future now looks less bright than it used to look in 2020, and this is because of change of the role of Russia. In 2020, we thought that free Belarus will continue as a bridge between West and East. Now it's clear that whoever will be a new Belarusian government, they will need to choose. If you choose to stay with Russia, you stay with a stagnating economy, and it would be hard to renew trade with Ukraine and European Union. If you cut ties with Russia, leaving like possible military operation of Russia just without, you lose like 20-30% of GDP, and people are very unhappy because links are very strong. Another thing, like democratic Belarus, non-democratic Russia, it means that Belarus cannot trade oil because Belarus cannot buy cheap oil. Democratic Russia, democratic Belarus, Belarus cannot trade oil because Russia will trade oil by themselves. So we are losing this marginal oil market. It would be hard, not impossible, but hard to bring back the status of IT country because moving is always very hard. Sierz said that he was surprised that not that many people moved from Belarus. Moving is very hard. And moving back is as hard as moving forward. So we are likely not to see a large portion of people that moved away. With regard to sanctions and how they work or don't work, this is, of course, not an area of my expertise, and good experts would not answer this question, but I will. I see it as a little bit philosophic question. We lived until the first half of the 20th century with idea of national states, and if dictator in a given country beats his own population, other countries say that it's not their deal, they do not intervene, and it finished in many very horrible occasions, including one that took place in Germany. After the Second World War, many countries decided that whenever they see that some dictator is abusing power, they should intervene and do something. Now there are two general ways to intervene. One is military intervention. We've seen several of these operations in recent years, like Gaddafi, but it has its own very risky points and troubles, of course. I don't think that many people support it. And another way is some softer way of intervention, economic intervention, and here comes sanctions. That's why everybody discusses sanctions. That's why everybody try to believe that sanctions is this miracle solution, because people generally don't want to go to the war. Well, if you are not Vladimir Putin, of course. So the thing is that it is a bad solution. It is an instrument that hurts not just targeted individuals, but hurts general economy, hurts those people who were actually on the streets of Minsk protesting. The question is, what is an alternative to do nothing? Well, to do nothing, we've seen it in the first part of the 20th century, or military intervention. Well, it has its own really bad risks. How I would change or try to make sanctions a little bit better? Well, I would make sanctions way more specific. For example, if you would look at Belarusian sanctions right now, just a second. Like some of them are for hijacking a plane. Well, what does it mean? What Belarus should do to cancel these sanctions? Stop hijacking planes? Well, Belarus, of course, is not hijacking planes anymore because planes are not flying over. So if sanction would be for beating people, then it's easier. Okay, you don't beat people, this sanction is cancelled. So I would attach like a roadmap how to cancel each sanction and make sanctions much more specific. And I completely agree with Serge. I would add a lot of positive agenda to counterweight the sanctions effects.
Thank you very much, Lev. So I guess it's a good proposal for the discussion in the break. We've stolen 9 minutes of your break. Sorry for that. But I hope that Yulia, Lev, Robert, and Serge give you some enlightenment and you know more than before the discussion. That would be at least, if we reach this goal, then I guess we can all be satisfied. So thank you very much. Applause to the panel.